Randall Mamet, a successful businessman, his wife Sydney, a dedicated homemaker, and Sydney's daughter from a previous marriage. Celeste lived in a sprawling house. Their neighbors saw them as the perfect family. Affluent, attractive, and seemingly happy. But beneath the polished exterior of manicured lawns and dinner parties, a sinister undercurrent was about to pull the Mamets into a vortex of forbidden desire, betrayal, and ultimately, violence. What began as a typical case of marital discontent would spiral into a shocking tale of taboo romance between stepfather and stepdaughter, culminating in a confrontation that ended in twisted death and others' lives shattered beyond repair. Randall and Sydney Mamet's romance began like many others, with a chance encounter at a charity gala in Philadelphia in the spring of 2010. Randall, then 35, was a rising star in the world of finance, known for his sharp mind and charismatic personality. Sydney, 32 at the time, was a divorcee with a young daughter, working as an interior designer for wealthy clients. Their whirlwind courtship captivated their social circle. Randall was smitten by Sydney's elegance and wit, while Sydney saw in Randall the stability and success she craved after her tumultuous first marriage. Within 6 months, Randall had proposed, presenting Sydney with a dazzling diamond ring that became the envy of their friends. The wedding, held at the prestigious Rittenhouse Hotel, was the social event of the season. Sydney's 7-year-old daughter Celeste served as the flower girl, her cherubic face beaming as she watched her mother marry the man who would become her stepfather. For the first few years, the Mammoth seemed to thrive. Randall's career continued to soar, and he was soon made partner at his firm. Sydney threw herself into the role of the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties and charity events that cemented their status in elite circles. She doted on Celeste, ensuring the girl wanted for nothing, from the best schools to extravagant vacations, but as the novelty of their new life together wore off, cracks began to appear in the foundation of their marriage. Randall's long hours at the office and frequent business trips left Sydney feeling neglected. She had given up her career to support his, and now found herself increasingly isolated in their large empty house. Sydney's attempts to rekindle the romance were met with indifference from Randall, who seemed more interested in his spreadsheets than his wife. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, became terse exchanges about household matters and Celeste's school schedule. By the time Celeste entered high school, the Mammoth's marriage existed mostly for show. They slept in separate bedrooms, citing Randall snoring as the reason to curious friends. Their interactions were cordial, but cold, like business partners rather than loving spouses. Sydney threw herself into volunteer work and her role as Celeste's mother, living vicariously through her daughter's achievements and social life. Randall buried himself deeper in his work, taking on more responsibilities at the firm and spending even less time at home. Neither was willing to admit defeat and file for divorce. Their shared fear of scandal, the comfort of their lifestyle, and concern for how it would affect Celeste kept them trapped in their loveless union. Little did they know that their carefully maintained facade was about to crumble in the most unexpected and tragic way. As Celeste blossomed from a precocious child into a striking young woman, the dynamics in the Mammoth household began to shift. Now 18 and preparing for college, Celeste had inherited her mother's grace and her biological father's vivacious spirit. Celeste's relationship with her mother had always been close, if sometimes strained by Sydney's tendency to overprotect and live through her daughter's experiences. With Randall, however, things had been more complicated. In the early years of the marriage, he had been a doting stepfather, attending her recitals and helping with homework. But as his marriage to Sydney cooled, so did his interactions with Celeste, the change during Celeste's senior year of high school. Randall, perhaps feeling the weight of his own mortality as he approached 50, began to take a renewed interest in his stepdaughter's life. He attended her dance performances, beaming with pride from the audience. He engaged her in conversations about her college plans, offering advice on majors and career paths. Sydney at first was pleased to see Randall finally acting like part of the family again. She encouraged the father-daughter bonding, hoping it might somehow bridge the gulf in their marriage, but as the months wore on, she began to sense something unsettling in the way Randall looked at Celeste, in the way their conversations would stop abruptly when she entered a room. Celeste, for her part, found herself drawn to Randall in a way that both excited and confused her. His attention made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. She began to dress more carefully when she knew he'd be home, to seek out his company. Under the guise of needing help with college applications or financial advice, the attention in the house grew palpable. Family dinners became a minefield of loaded glances and double entendres. Sydney watched with growing unease as her daughter and husband orbited each other, their gravitational pull seeming to exclude her entirely. As Celeste's high school graduation approached, the mammoth house was a powder keg of unspoken desires and simmering resentments. None of them could have predicted the explosion that was to come, or the devastating aftermath that would follow. Celine between appropriate stepfather-stepdaughter affection and something more sinister was crossed on a rainy night in April, just weeks before Celeste's graduation. Sydney was out of town for a charity event, leaving Randall and Celeste alone in the house. They had settled in to watch a movie, a bottle of wine between them. Randall reasoning that at 18, Celeste was old enough for a glass or two under parental supervision. As the wine flowed in the storm raged outside, their inhibitions lowered. Celeste, emboldened by alcohol in the charged atmosphere, confessed to Randall that she had always found him attractive. Randall, his judgment clouded and his loneliness overwhelming, responded not with the fatherly dismissal he should have, but with a confession of his own growing feelings. One touch led to another, and soon they found themselves entangled on the couch, years of suppressed attraction exploding into a passionate encounter. The next morning brought with its shame, confusion, and the thrill of forbidden fruit tasted. Both Randall and Celeste swore it would never happen again, that it was a mistake born of loneliness and wine. But the dam had broken, and the flood of desire was not so easily contained. Stolen glances became stolen kisses. Furtive touches beneath the dinner table. Coded text messages arranging clandestine meetings. They justified their actions to themselves and each other. Randall wasn't Celeste's real father, they reasoned. Sydney had been cold and distant for years. They were both consenting adults, love, they told each other, couldn't be wrong. But the guilt knotted them, particularly Celeste. She saw the pain in her mother's eyes, the growing suspicion. She knew the devastating impact this would have if discovered. Yet she couldn't bring herself to end it, addicted to the rush of their forbidden romance. Randall compartmentalized, as he did with all aspects of his life. When with Sydney, he played the role of distant but beautiful husband. With his colleagues, he was the consummate professional. But in those secret moments with Celeste, he allowed himself to feel a passion he thought he had lost forever. Their trysts became more frequent and daring as the weeks passed. A rendezvous at a motel on the outskirts of town, under the guise of college tours, heated encounters in Randall's car, parked in secluded spots. Each time they swore it would be the last. Each time they found themselves drawn back together, powerless against the pull of their illicit desire. But as spring turned to summer, the web of lies they had woven began to tangle, threatening to ensnare them all. As Celeste's freshman year of college approached, the affair between her and Randall intensified. The impending separation seemed to fuel their passion. Each encounter tinged with a desperate urgency. They began taking greater risks, their need for each other overriding their caution. Randall started finding excuses to visit Celeste at her college campus, a mere 2-hour drive away. He would claim business meetings in the area, when in reality he was spending long luxurious afternoons, tangled in the sheets of Celeste's dorm room. Celeste, for her part, would invent study groups and extracurricular activities to explain her frequent trips home on weekends. Their behavior began to impact their relationships with others. Randall grew even more distant from Sydney, barely able to look at her without feeling a stab of guilt. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, using it as both an escape and an excuse for his absences. Celeste struggled to connect with her college peers, always holding back, always guarding her explosive secret. The affair also began to change them as individuals. Randall, reinvigorated by his relationship with Celeste, started paying more attention to his appearance. He joined a gym, updated his wardrobe, even contemplated hair restoration treatments. His colleagues remarked on his newfound energy, assuming he had finally found work-life balance. Celeste, meanwhile, found herself torn between exhilaration and shame. She excelled in her studies, channeling her turbulent emotions into her coursework, but her social life suffered. She rebuffed advances from classmates, unable to contemplate a normal relationship while entangled with her stepfather. There were close calls that should have served as wake-up calls. Once, Sydney nearly walked in on them in a compromising position in the pool house, saved only by a well-timed phone call that delayed her arrival home. Another time, one of Celeste's doormates spotted Randall leaving her room early in the morning, leading to awkward questions that Celeste clumsily deflected. Despite these near misses, Randall and Celeste convinced themselves they could maintain their secret indefinitely. They began making tentative plans for a future together, whispering about the day when they could finally be open about their love. Randall spoke of divorcing Sydney, of starting a new life with Celeste once she finished college. Celeste daydreamed about a fairytale wedding, conveniently ignoring the devastation it would wreak on her mother, but as their fantasy future grew more elaborate, so did the tangled web of lies required to sustain their present. Randall's finances came under scrutiny at home, as Sydney questioned the increased business expenses and mysterious cash withdrawals. Celeste's academic performance, while still strong, began to slip as the stress of her double life took its toll. The pressure began to mount, the cracks in their carefully constructed facade widening day by day. Still they persisted, each stolen moment together reinforcing their belief that their love was worth any cost. They failed to see that the price would be far higher than either of them could have imagined, and that the bill was coming due far sooner than they knew. It was during a lunch with her friend Beatrice that the first inkling of the terrible truth began to form in Sydney's mind. Beatrice, ever the gossip, mentioned offhandedly that she'd seen Randall and Celeste having an intense conversation at a cafe in town, at a time when Celeste was supposed to be at college and Randall at work. The way Beatrice described their body language, leaning in close hands touching on the table, sent a chill down Sydney's spine. She brushed it off, laughing too loudly and changing the subject. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. From that moment on, Sydney began to pay closer attention to the interactions between her husband and daughter. She noticed the lingering glances, the inside jokes she wasn't privy to, the way they always seemed to find reasons to be alone together. As the evidence mounted, Sydney found herself trapped in a state of denial. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate, but with each passing day, the truth she didn't want to face inched closer to the surface, threatening to explode into the open and shatter their lives forever. The day Sydney's world imploded started like any other. It was a warm June morning, the air heavy with the promise of summer storms. Sydney had plans to meet friends for lunch, but a last-minute cancellation left her with an unexpected free afternoon. On a whim, she decided to surprise Randall at his office. Perhaps suggest an impromptu date night to rekindle their faltering connection, but Randall wasn't in his office. His assistant, flustered by Sydney's unexpected appearance, let slip that Mr. Mamet had left early, mentioning something about a family emergency. Sydney felt her blood run cold. There was no family emergency she knew of. With trembling hands, she took out her phone and opened the tracking app she had installed weeks ago in a moment of paranoid weakness. The pulsing dot of Randall's location appeared not at home, not at any hospital, but at a nondescript address on the outskirts of town. The drive to that address was a blur. Sydney moved on autopilot, her mind racing through possibilities, each more devastating than the last. She pulled up to a small motel, the kind that rented rooms by the hour, and there in the parking lot was Randall's car. Sydney sat in her vehicle, paralyzed with indecision. Did she really want to know? Couldn't she just drive away? Pretend she'd never seen this? But then another car pulled into the lot, Celeste's beat-up college Honda. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sydney watched her daughter hurry across the parking lot and knock on one of the motel room doors. It opened. Randall's familiar silhouette visible for a moment before Celeste slipped inside. Sydney sat in stunned silence, her mind refusing to process what her eyes had just witnessed. Seconds stretched into minutes as she stared at the closed motel room door, willing it to be some sort of mistake, a misunderstanding. Anything but the betrayal it so clearly was. Finally, operating on instinct rather than conscious thought, Sydney got out of her car. She raised her hand to knock, then paused, her fist trembling in midair. From inside she could hear muffled laughter. Celeste's musical giggle, Randall's deeper chuckle. The sounds of happiness and intimacy twisted like a knife in her gut. With a deep breath, Sydney steeled herself and rapped sharply on the door. The laughter inside abruptly ceased, replaced by hushed panicked whispers. She knocked again, louder this time. Her calm facade cracking as she called out, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she heard movement inside. The door opened slowly, revealing Randall, his hair mussed and shirt hastily buttoned. Behind him, Sydney could see Celeste, her face a mask of guilt and fear. In that moment, as Sydney looked from her husband to her daughter, the full weight of their betrayal came crashing down upon her. Her world, already fragile, shattered completely. The tension in the small motel room was suffocating as Sydney stepped inside, her eyes darting between Randall and Celeste. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the ancient air conditioner and the pounding of Sydney's heart in her ears. Randall was the first to break the silence, his voice strained as he attempted to explain. But Sydney cut him off, her voice eerily calm. Randall stepped forward, attempting to shield Celeste. "Sydney, please. This isn't Celeste's fault." A harsh laugh escaped Sydney's lips. The argument escalated quickly. Years of pent-up resentment and betrayal pouring out. Accusations flew back and forth. Sydney accused Randall of grooming Celeste, of taking advantage of her youth and innocence. Randall defended their relationship, insisting it was real love, that Celeste is an adult now. Celeste, caught between her mother and the man she thought she loved, tried desperately to mediate. She pleaded with Sydney to understand, swore that Randall had never taken advantage of her, that their feelings were mutual. But Sydney was beyond reason. In her eyes, this was the ultimate betrayal. Not just of her as a wife, but as a mother. As the shouting reached a fever pitch, Sydney noticed Randall inching towards the bedside table. She saw the glint of metal and realized with a jolt of fear that he was reaching for something. The gun he always kept for protection. Time seemed to slow down. Sydney lunged for Randall, determined to stop him from doing something unthinkable. Celeste, seeing her mother's sudden movement, misinterpreted it as an attack on Randall and tried to intervene. In the ensuing scuffle, the gun went off. The sound of the shot was deafening in the small room. For a moment, everything went still. Then Celeste crumpled to the floor, a red stain blossoming on her shirt. Sydney's scream of anguish shattered the silence. Randall stood frozen, the gun slipping from his nervous fingers. as Sydney frantically tried to stem the blood flowing from her daughter's wound. The full horror of what had happened began to sink in. Their secret was out. And the consequences were far more devastating than any of them could have imagined. The gunshot at the motel brought a swift response from local law enforcement. Within minutes, the small parking lot was awash and flashing lights as police cars and an ambulance converged on the scene. First responders found a tableau of tragedy in room 114. Celeste lay on the floor, barely clinging to life despite Sydney's desperate attempts to stop the bleeding. Randall Mammoth sat slumped in a corner, his eyes vacant, the gun still on the floor where he had dropped it. Sydney, her hands and clothes covered in her daughter's blood, alternated between frantic pleas to the paramedics and incoherent sobs. Detective Liam Donovan, a veteran of the small police force, took charge of the scene. As Celeste was rushed to the hospital, Donovan began the grim task of piecing together what had happened in that motel room. The physical evidence was clear enough. One shot fired, one victim. The gun registered to Randall Mammoth. But the why of it all was murkier. Initial questioning of Sydney and Randall yielded conflicting stories, both too distraught to provide a coherent account of events. As news of the shooting spread, the quiet community was rocked by shock and disbelief. The Mammoths had always seemed like the perfect family. Successful, respected, involved in local charities. The idea that such violence could erupt among them was almost inconceivable to their neighbors and friends. In the days that followed, as Celeste fought for her life in the ICU, Detective Donovan and his team worked tirelessly to unravel the truth. They combed through phone records, interviewed friends and colleagues and dug into the family's background. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a family not nearly as perfect as their polished exterior suggested. As Detective Donovan delved deeper into the Mammoth case, the facade of the perfect family crumbled rapidly. Interviews with family friends and colleagues painted a picture of a marriage long devoid of love, held together by appearances and financial convenience. Beatrice Whitaker, Sydney's closest friend, provided crucial information about Sydney's growing suspicions in the months leading up to the shooting. She recounted tearful lunches where Sydney had confided her fears about Randall's possible infidelity, never suspecting the true nature of his betrayal. Randall's co-workers described a man who had seemed rejuvenated in recent months, speaking often of a new love in his life. They had assumed he was having a typical midlife crisis affair, never imagining the object of his affection was his own stepdaughter. But it was Celeste, college roommate, who provided the most damning evidence. Once assured of police confidentiality, Zoe shared a trove of text messages Celeste had sent her, detailing the affair with Randall, and the sort of giddy, love-struck language typical of a young woman in the throes of what she believed to be true love. The digital trail proved to be a goldmine for investigators. Subpoenaed phone records showed hundreds of calls and messages between Randall and Celeste, often at odd hours. Financial records showed a pattern of expensive gifts from Randall to Celeste. Jewelry, designer clothes, even a car, all carefully hidden from Sydney. There were records of hotel stays, weekend getaways disguised as business trips or college visits. As the evidence mounted, the full extent of Randall and Celeste's deception became clear. This was no sudden passion, no momentary lapse in judgment. Their affair had been going on for over a year, meticulously planned and hidden from Sydney and the world. The revelation of the affair shed new light on the events in the motel room. What had first appeared to be a case of accidental discharge during a heated argument now looked more like a potential crime of passion as Celeste slowly recovered in the hospital. The question on everyone's mind was, who had really pulled the trigger? Was it Randall attempting to silence Celeste to save himself, Sydney in a fit of rage at their betrayal, or Celeste herself, overcome with guilt and shame when confronted by her mother? The truth, Detective Donovan suspected, might be more complex than any of them had initially thought. District Attorney took personal charge of the case after reviewing the evidence gathered by Detective Donovan and his team. She made the decision to charge both Randall and Sydney Mammoth with attempted murder. Randall, once the picture of corporate success, appeared haggard and defeated in his orange jumpsuit. His defense team, led by high-powered attorney Xavier Brockton, argued that the shooting had been a tragic accident, the result of a struggle for the gun during a heated family argument. Sydney, by contrast, seemed to have aged years in the week since the incident. Her lawyer painted her as a victim, a woman betrayed by her husband and daughter who had acted in self-defense when she believed Randall was reaching for the gun to silence them both. The question of Celeste's role in the incident loomed large over the proceedings. As the only witness to the shooting besides her parents, her testimony would be crucial. But Celeste, still recovering from her injuries, had so far invoked her Fifth Amendment rights, refusing to testify against either parent. In the end, Randall Mammoth accepted the plea deal. In a hushed courtroom, he pleaded guilty to aggravated assault, receiving a sentence of 10 years in prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Sydney one last time, a look that spoke volumes about the pain, betrayal, and regret that had torn their family apart. Sydney, charges against her dropped, left the courthouse a free woman, but one irrevocably changed by the ordeal. Within months, she had sold the family home and moved out of state, seeking a fresh start away from the whispers and sidelong glances. Celeste, once she recovered from her physical wounds, faced the daunting task of healing her emotional and psychological scars. She withdrew from college, entering intensive therapy to deal with the trauma of the shooting and the complicated emotions surrounding her relationship with Randall. Her relationship with Sydney remained strained. The breach of trust between mother and daughter, a chasm not easily bridged. The Mammoth case faded from the national spotlight, but its impact lingered. It served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most picture-perfect families can harbor dark secrets. The community, shaken by the violence that had erupted in their midst, began initiatives to address domestic violence and promote healthier family dynamics.